For my money, though, the single most fascinating story in all of this is what has just been reported by veteran investigative journalist Dexter Filkins at The New Yorker. Just before the presidential election on Halloween, October 31st, 2016, Franklin Foer published this fascinating and very controversial piece at Slate.com. And honestly, it has been driving me nuts ever since. We've talked about this reporting a few other times on the show. You might remember it was about logs of internet traffic, logs of communication between different computers on the internet that appeared to show frequent and somewhat inexplicable contact all of a sudden during the presidential campaign between a computer server at the Trump Organization and a computer server at a Russian bank called Alfa Bank. Alfa is the biggest private bank in Russia. They have friendly relations with the Kremlin. You don't get to be big anything in Russia without friendly relations with the Kremlin. Alfa Bank is mentioned in the Christopher Steele dossier that was published to such great controversy right before the inauguration. Executives from Alfa Bank actually went on to sue BuzzFeed for publishing the dossier because the dossier does mention this Alfa Bank. Just a couple of months ago in August, that lawsuit against BuzzFeed was dismissed in a U.S. court. For what it's worth, I should tell you that one of the billionaire founders of Alfa Bank has a daughter. Not that long ago, his daughter married Alex van der Zwaan. Crazy, right? One of the only people who's gone to jail so far in the Mueller investigation. Probably all just a big coinky-dink. But for whatever reason, at the height of the campaign in 2016, a server used by that bank kept making contact with a server at the Trump Organization. When that server was being used for almost nothing else, why was it communicating with a Russian bank? It's a vexing little mystery. Ever since Franklin Foer first reported on it for Slate.com 2 years ago, Halloween night, right before the 2016 election, it has been a very controversial piece of reporting. Well, now, Dexter Filkins at The New Yorker has picked that up and run with it. And, you know, even if you have felt like this is one of those confusing stories, one of those sidebar stories about the Russia investigation that seems too technical and you're not sure you get it, pick up a copy of The New Yorker or go to NewYorker.com. Just print out this Dexter Filkins article. Don't read it online. Print it out. Read it on paper. Read it in a quiet moment. One of the blessings here is that Dexter Filkins is a very, very good writer. And I promise you, even if you have been mystified by this story before, you will be intrigued by it the way that he has written it up. And I'm going to let him tell you the story. But just to prepare you for that conversation, here's a few things that he sort of blew the lid off here with this piece in The New Yorker. Number one, turns out that at the same time Franklin Foer was pursuing this story at the very end of the presidential campaign in 2016, the New York Times had been pursuing it too. Investigative reporter for the Times named Eric Lichtblau had the story and was working on it even before Franklin Foer started working on it for Slate. As part of reporting that story, Eric Lichtblau at the Times apparently came to learn that the FBI had an open counterintelligence investigation underway into possible contacts between people associated with then presidential candidate Donald Trump and Russia. Oh, which means before the election, the New York Times was in possession of the story that there was an open FBI counterintelligence investigation into Trump and Russia before the election. Did I mention that they knew this before the election? Remember that headline about Donald Trump being the subject of an open FBI counterintelligence investigation about him and his campaign's contacts with Russia right before the election, the one that blew the lid off the election and changed it? No, the New York Times did not run that story, even though they knew that that counterintelligence investigation was underway. New York Times instead ran this rather infamous story, also on October 31st. Which basically said, yeah, you know, the FBI looked into some stuff about Trump. People have been asking questions about Russia and stuff. Turns out it's all fine. There's nothing there. That's the story they ran on October 31st, when the Times knew at that moment through its own reporting that actually an FBI counterintelligence investigation into these contacts had begun and stood open. And they knew that directly because the FBI asked their own reporter, Eric Lichtblau, to hold off on some of what he had to report about this Alfa Bank thing because they were looking into it too, and they didn't want it to interfere with their ongoing counterintelligence investigation. So they knew. I love me the New York Times. As far as I'm concerned, the New York Times is the eighth wonder of the world. I do not want to imagine an America without the New York Times or with a lesser New York Times. But when it comes to how they handled the information that they had about FBI interest in the two presidential candidates in 2016, at some point there presumably will have to be a little bit of a come-to-Jesus moment about that, because that is a heck of a thing for the New York Times to have sat on and not published, especially given how dead the horse was they were aggressively beating at the time every day when it came to Hillary Clinton's emails. They knew Trump was the subject of a counterintelligence investigation at the FBI at the time. They didn't tell us. The Times has sort of apologized for that Halloween 2016 story since it ran. They've never run a correction. They sort of explained that their own disappointment in it. But now we know. The Times knew. Trump was under active FBI counterintelligence investigation before the election. They didn't publish it. The Times also effectively killed what would have been corroborating reporting from Eric Lichtblau on that strange thing about Alfa Bank and the Trump Organization servers, which Franklin Foer ended up reporting all on his own at Slate to so much controversy. These odd communications between a Russian bank server and the Trump server, their reporting could have corroborated that too. For this New Yorker piece, Eric Lichtblau told Filkins, quote, "Not only is there clearly something there, but there's clearly something that someone has gone to great lengths to conceal." That's not what the Times published, but that's what their reporter found. Dexter Filkins also, for the first time, explains in layman's terms what kind of communications, what kind of interactions between someone in Russia and someone at the Trump Organization might have produced the kind of internet data that led to all of this reporting. And I will let him explain that in just a moment, because for me, that was kind of the aha moment. Finally, somebody has spelled out what this might have been. What would turn up looking like this in these internet logs? What kinds of communication, what amount of communication, what might have gone down here that produced this evidence? But perhaps most importantly, where Dexter Filkins finally gets with this story is how this intrigue could finally one day end. How you could make this question one day have an answer. How this story and all of this intrigue and this particular mystery could finally be explained and put to bed. Quote, "This March, after Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee announced that they had found no evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, the committee's Democrats filed a dissent, arguing that there were many matters still to be investigated, including the Trump Organization's connections to Alfa Bank. The Democrats implored the majority Republicans to force a company involved in the communication between these servers, a company called Sendin, to turn over computer data that would help determine what had happened. Quote, those records could show who in the Trump Organization used the server. There would probably also be a record of who shut down the Trump domain after the Times contacted Alfa Bank for comment on its reporting. Sendin might also have records of any outgoing communications sent by the Trump Organization. Quote, but such a request for further investigation is unlikely to proceed as long as Republicans hold the majority. In other words, if there really was the story that's been so intriguing for 2 years now, if there really was a secret line of communication set up between Trump Tower and Moscow during the election, when they tried to cover up, that could be sort of the missing link in terms of figuring out how involved the Trump campaign was in the Russian effort to interfere in the election on Trump's behalf. Right? And if anybody really wants to figure out whether that secret line of communication was there, it's doable. You could figure it out. They could probably do it with just a couple of subpoenas. And in fact, if Democrats win the House 4 weeks from tonight, it looks like Democrats are ready to go with subpoenas to get that information, which means we'd finally have an answer. Now, one does, of course, wonder if Robert Mueller and his prosecutors have already beaten the Democrats there, either before Dexter Filkins published this piece or since it has been out. But Dexter Filkins joins us next. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.